Greetings and welcome to the third video in this series on interpersonal effectiveness. In the previous video, we learned the dear adult skill to advocate, appreciate, and apologize. In this video, we will learn a few more tips for effective negotiation, effective compromise, and effective refusal. So let's get started. There are many ways to negotiate effectively, so here are a few examples. To think dialectically, to think win-win, to turn the tables, to take partial responsibility, to offer to be part of the solution, to use connect talk as opposed to control talk, and to dialogue about principles rather than positions. You've probably already noticed that, these are themes that we've already talked about in the previous video when we learned the dear adult skill. So the first technique, think dialectically, we have covered this in depth. But just as a quick review, to think dialectically in a practical sense means to let go of black and white thinking or all or nothing thinking. Instead, look for those shades of gray. To think dialectically also means to remember that there's always more than one perspective. And therefore, thinking dialectically means in a very practical sense to find the grain of truth in a perspective that you disagree with, right? Even in perspectives that you disagree with, those are especially the perspectives that you need to find the grain of truth. Another technique to keep in mind in order to negotiate effectively is to think win-win. Once again, whether or not you're using an actual formal dear adult intervention, it's always important to keep in mind win-win thinking. In other words, my wants and needs are important, but so are the other person's, right? My priorities and values are valid, and so are the other person's, right? I have my goals and commitments, and so does the other person, right? So win-win thinking means that we keep both of those realities in mind at all times. Okay, another technique for effective negotiation is to turn the tables. So what does that mean? Well, this is a really good technique to use when no matter what you suggest or recommend or propose, the other person just shoots it down every time. So when that happens, what do? Well, you can simply turn the tables and say something like, okay, so what would you recommend? Or what would you suggest? Or what would you propose? Another technique for effective negotiation is to take partial responsibility. So what does that mean exactly? Well, it means let go of blame and who's right versus who's wrong, right? So obviously, do not accept blame for what's not your fault. However, simply acknowledge your contribution to the issue. Whether it was intentional or not is actually mostly irrelevant. And furthermore, if you want the other person to take some responsibility as well, then you may need to model that for them. Okay, another technique to keep in mind if you want to effectively negotiate is to offer to be part of the solution. So in other words, do not expect the other person to make all the changes. That's simply not reasonable. Even if you did not cause the problem, you may still need to be part of the solution. And once again, if you want the other person to make some changes, you may need to model that for them. Another technique to keep in mind is to use connect talk as opposed to control talk. So what do we mean by control talk? Well, first of all, avoid the you bomb. In other words, avoid starting off every other sentence with you. Why? Because that comes across as bossy or blamey. In other words, controlling. Instead of overusing the pronoun you, what you can do is pluralize or collectivize your personal pronouns. So in other words, instead of saying you, consider replacing that with we or our or us. So for example, instead of saying you never wash the dishes, you can say we don't seem to have a system in place to know whose turn it is to wash dishes. And another really important technique to negotiate effectively is to learn to dialogue about principles rather than positions. Let me give you a silly example. So let's assume a couple wants to buy a new car, but let's assume they already have their positions in place. One spouse wants a Ford, the other spouse wants a Chevy. Well, how in the world are you going to compromise or negotiate around that? Like, half a Ford, half Chevy, right? That doesn't even make sense, right? This couple is probably going to get nowhere if they already have their positions, right? So if they try to dialogue about positions that they already have, it's not going to be much of a dialogue at all. It's going to be much more of a debate. And the more they debate, the more they're both going to be even more convinced of the position that they already have. So instead of dialoguing around positions, what if they instead dialogued about principles, such as we both want something that is fuel efficient, we both want something that is safe for the children, we both want extra space in the back for road trips. Do you see now there's going to be much more room for a dialogue? And there's going to be much more opportunity to brainstorm many more solutions and maybe many better solutions than their original positions. So once again, dialogue about principles, not about positions. Let's talk about compromise in a little more detail. I want to propose a specific procedure for effective compromise. Especially works really well when two or more people are completely gridlocked on an issue. This is an intervention you can use. Each party draws two concentric circles to form a donut. So you have an inner circle and an outer circle. In the inner circle, both parties write down their core needs or values, which they are not willing or able to flex. That's completely fine to have certain areas that you're not willing to bend on. So you might as well identify those up front. And that's the point here. When couples or other people are gridlocked, it's because of certain unspoken values or core needs. The point here is, let's express them so they're no longer unspoken. But then in the outer circle, both parties write down the aspects of the issue that they can be more flexible about. Usually specific details or specific logistics that aren't as important and that both parties can be flexible about. So now both parties share what they wrote in their circles, right? Both the inner circle and the outer circle. And they explain why, including a respectful question and answer dialogue, right? So, these are my core needs and values that I can't flex on. But then here are also some other areas, some other details or aspects that I can be flexible about. And in the course of having a simple conversation about these two circles, it's very common for both parties to arrive upon at least a provisional compromise that they can tentatively implement and then revisit or revise as necessary, right? The point of this exercise is not necessarily to come to some brilliant compromise that will remain in effect for life and it's now set in stone. No, the point is to simply start to dialogue, start to converse, and in the course of that conversation, come up with maybe some fresh ideas that you can implement at the very least on a provisional or tentative basis to move from gridlock into, all right, let's start experimenting here with some possibilities. Okay, but sometimes it's necessary to refuse instead of negotiating or compromise. So there are also some techniques to do that. So if it's necessary to refuse, one technique is to use a broken record. In other words, just repeat your stance over and over and over again. Another simple technique is simply to say no thanks and move on. Or make an excuse, or give a reason, or suggest an alternative, or to change the subject, or if none of these other options are working, maybe simply walk away. So regardless of which of these strategies you use, it's important to appear confident, even if that's not how you feel. And we will actually talk more about appearing confident in a subsequent video. Let's summarize a few of the key points we have covered in this video. So point number one, there are many ways to negotiate effectively, such as think dialectically, think win-win, turn the tables, take partial responsibility, offer you part of the solution, use connect talk as opposed to control talk, and dialogue about principles as opposed to positions. And then also to compromise. Point number two, Speaking of compromise, an effective way to compromise includes the following steps. Each party draws 2 concentric circles to form a donut. In the inner circle, both parties write down their core needs or values which they are not willing or able to flex. In the outer circle, both parties write down the aspects of the issue that they can be more flexible about. Next, both parties share what they wrote in their circles and why, including a respectful question-and-answer dialogue. As a result of this conversation, it is very common for both parties to arrive upon at least a provisional compromise that they can tentatively implement and revisit or revise as necessary. And point number 3. Sometimes it is necessary to refuse instead of negotiating or compromise. There are also many ways to effectively refuse. Use a broken record, say no thanks, make an excuse, give a reason, suggest an alternative, change the subject, or simply walk away. Regardless of which of these strategies you use, it is important to appear confident, even if that's not how you actually feel.